Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today's video is going to be a wrap up of all of the books I've read so far this year. I haven't read as many books so far this year as I would have liked to have. I'm 4 books behind on my reading goal according to Storygraph. But the books that I have read so far this year I have quite enjoyed, or at least most of them I have. I think we can skip out on quantity in order to maintain quality. I'm gonna run you through all of the books I've read so far this year and give you my thoughts and give you a little bit of a backstory on each book. Hopefully this is a fun video for all of us. So I'm gonna start with the first book that I read this year and work my way all the way up to the book that I'm currently reading. The first book I read this year is probably one of my favorite books I've read so far this year, and I think it will stay one of my favorites up until the end of the year. It is The Beautiful Indifference by Sarah Hall. This is a collection of short stories. I think there are 7 or 9 short stories in here. Let's see if they say. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, 7 short stories. And I must say, even though they don't all follow a theme, they are all very weird and very obsessive is the word I want to use, but it's not really the right word. I just mean obsessive in the sense that all of the short stories give you a lot of very detailed information about what's happening at all times and about the characters and about the surroundings, which I found really interesting, and I really enjoyed these short stories. Obviously I enjoyed some of these short stories more than others, but that's just the way it is with short story collections, as it is with poetry. You don't always enjoy all of the poems in a poetry collection. The most important thing is that you enjoy the collection as a whole. So, this is my first read of the year, and it was very, very good. I'm very intrigued to read more of Sarah Hall's stuff, and I can't wait to get my hands on more. Then the second book I read this year I don't have a copy of because I borrowed it from the bookshop that I work at. But it is, I will put pictures of all the books that I don't have physical copies of. I'll put them on the screen. It is Villa America by Lisa Klaussmann, and it centers on Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who are real people, so it's historical fiction in a sense, because it's partially based on letters and diary entries by all of the characters in this book, but it is also fictionalized because you can never really know what happens just based off of the diaries and letters that you read of people. So it centers around Sarah and Gerald Murphy living on the French coast, I believe, and they are friends with people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald. They're friends with Ernest Hemingway and his wife, and his lover, I think. But lots of very famous people from history were friends with Sarah and Gerald Murphy, and it's basically just a fictionalized version of a couple of years in their life spent at Villa America and around Villa America on the French coast. And I must say, I really enjoyed this book as well. I should have actually bought the copy of the book that I borrowed from the bookshop, because I would read it again. It's one of those books that I would definitely read again, so I should have actually bought the copy, but I didn't think I was gonna think about it this much after having read it when I gave the book back to the bookshop. But anyway, here I am, still thinking about it. It's also one of my favorite books I've read this year, so I started my year off with some really great books. It didn't continue that way for the rest of the year so far, but I did start out with some great books. Then the next book I read was this little short thing, this Penguin Modern edition, The Breakthrough by Daphne du Maurier. And this is, well, it is science fiction. It is about a scientist, or a group of scientists really, who are doing some experiments for the British government that are interesting to say the least, but then on the side, unbeknownst to the British government. Is it the British government? I don't remember if it's the British government or the American government, to be honest, but I think it's the British government. But anyway, unbeknownst to whichever government they're doing experiments for, or research for rather, I should say research, they are doing their own experiments to see if you can capture the energy of somebody's soul or life, or body rather, after they die. So if you capture their energy at the moment of their death, whether or not you can conserve it and keep it and like contain it, put it in a container essentially. I don't know what the heck they wanted to do with this energy that they captured, but anyway, so it's about that. It's very interesting and definitely made me want to read more of Daphne's works. So this was a good purchase. This was a good introduction to Daphne du Maurier's works, and I'm very interested to read more. Then the next book I read is actually a book I have read before, but I reread it this year by listening to it as an audiobook. It is Out of Love by Hazel Hayes. I listened to the audio version this time, and it is a good story, to be honest with you. I didn't like it as much this time as I did the first time around I read it, but I think that's just what happens when you reread books, because you kind of already know what's going to happen in the story. It's not novel anymore, and it's not as punchy or exciting as the first time you read it, but it is a great story nonetheless, and it is a very interesting way to tell a story. So essentially, this is a love story told in reverse. It starts, the story or the book starts where the couple break up and then moves backwards in time up until when they had their first date, I believe. And you get to learn about their relationship backwards, which is kind of weird, but also really interesting. It's really well written. Hazel Hayes is Irish, so there's Irish humor in this book, which I love. I love English and Irish, or I should say British and Irish humor. Very much the same kind of humor that I have, so I very much enjoy reading books by British and Irish authors. I hope somebody is intrigued enough by this book to pick it up, because it's really good. Then, the next book I read was a non-fiction book. It is The Past in Hiding. I'll put it up here. It's The Past in Hiding by Mark Roseman. It is a biography of a woman, a Jewish woman, who lived through the Second World War and who essentially hid for basically the last 3 years of the war. I think she had to go into hiding because her family was sent to concentration camps, but she escaped before they were sent away, and so she had to hide away so that the Nazis wouldn't find her. And it was a very well written biography. It's very thorough, it's very well researched, and it was a very enjoyable read, which is weird to say about a biography about somebody living through a world war, but she made it out alive. She made it out okay in the end, so it has a happy ending at the end of the day. And it was really interesting to read because it gave you some personal insights into the war and shows you just how much people had to work together to make things happen, and also how privileged people could get away with more, which, I mean, is the same for now as well. Privileged people still get away with much more than unprivileged people ever would. And it's really interesting. Well, it was really interesting for me to read because my mom's side of the family is German, and some of the place names, city or town names that were mentioned in the book are very familiar to me. They're very close to where my family, my mom's side of the family, live and where my mom grew up. So it was really interesting and shocking to read about these places. But it's really interesting to read people's personal stories of war instead of just reading facts about the war ended on this date and started on this day, and this is how many people died, and this is how many people were sent to concentration camps, and these concentration camps were in this and this and this place. It's really much more interesting to learn about historical things from a personal point of view. So, if anybody's interested in the Second World War, and even if you're not really, because I'm not much of a history person myself, but I did find this very interesting, pick the book up, give it a read. It's a very good read, and I would highly, highly recommend it. The next book I read was When We Were Birds by Ayanna Lloyd Banwo. It is a book set in Trinidad and Tobago, in a fictional town in Trinidad and Tobago. It follows two different perspectives. It follows the perspective of a man and of a woman, and how their paths cross and come together in interesting ways. The man works in a cemetery. He's a grave digger, essentially. And the woman is... how would you describe her? She's a descendant of what they call the corbeau, which is a bird that I don't know exactly what it does, but in this legend, the corbeau come to fly around somebody's house or a place when there's somebody who's going to die. And so these women are descended of those birds. This whole family line of women are descended of those birds, and their job is to look after people's souls after they die, essentially, if I'm describing that right. And so you get to see how this woman, who is a dead keeper, essentially, or who becomes a dead keeper throughout the course of the book, and this grave digger, how their paths cross and how they have to kind of work together to achieve things. And obviously they eventually fall in love, because that's how books work, and it is, after all, also a love story. And I'm not doing a very good job of describing it, but it was a really good book. It's one of my favorite books as well that I've read this year, as was The Parcel in Hiding. I forgot to mention that. It was really good. I really recommend it. It was something very different from what I've normally read. It's something, even though it is a known storyline of, you know, boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love, happy ever after, it was a different approach in that the backstory and the history of the people was not the same as it is in most other romance books. I would also highly recommend this book if anybody wants to read it, or just everybody actually should read this book. I think it's a very good book. I think it's a book that most people would enjoy. So there you go. Then the next book I read is Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, and I made an entire video about this book and about the movie and compared them to each other and gave my whole thoughts and rant about this book in that video. So I will link it up here if you're interested to hear all of my thoughts. But the gist of it was that I was a little bit disappointed by this book. It's not what I thought it was going to be, and the first roughly 90 pages of the book were quite boring, to be honest with you. They definitely serve a purpose in the story. I'm not saying that they should have been cut out of the story, but I feel like there was a way to make it more interesting to read, even if it was very mundane and boring stuff happening in the first 90 pages of the book. For those of you who don't know, Eileen follows the story of Eileen Dunlop, who is a 24-year-old woman working as a secretary in the boys' prison in somewhere in Massachusetts in the US. And her day-to-day is quite boring. She works at the boys' prison and then she goes home to look after her father, who's an alcoholic and who can't leave the house anymore, or who is a menace to society if he does leave the house. So she makes it that he can't leave the house. And essentially, Eileen is very bored with her own life, and she has a very rich and imaginative fantasy life that she lives in her head at some times. And then Rebecca St. John arrives on the scene. She comes to work at the boys' prison as well. She comes to work as a teacher for the boys in the boys' prison. In the movie, she's a psychologist. In the book, she's a teacher. And she sort of strikes up a friendship with Eileen. Eileen kind of becomes infatuated with her, falls in love with her a little bit. And they embark on a crime. I'm not giving anything away because all of this is on the back of the book. But they together commit a crime. And I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to give away the crime. I just want to mention that from the way that it was described on the back of the book, I thought the crime was going to be worse than it ended up being. Which is not probably a great thing to say, because it was a pretty bad crime, but the way that it's described in the synopsis, I thought it would have been way worse. So overall, I didn't really enjoy this book that much. I enjoyed the movie more, but it was an interesting book. It's an interesting story, and I do still think about it, so it kind of did its job. I feel this book kind of did its job of making you think about the story, even after you finished reading it. But I haven't read any of Ottessa's other work, so I can't compare it and say I would recommend another book over reading this one. So take my advice with a grain of salt. But I think you could probably read Ottessa Moshfegh's other works, and they would probably be more interesting. I don't know, I haven't read any of them. But there you go. The book that I'm currently reading is Our Wives Under the Sea, and I bought these two books at the same time, and man am I glad I bought these two books at the same time, because if I had only bought Eileen and bought nothing else, I would have been disappointed with my buying experience as a whole, because I didn't really enjoy Eileen that much. But this book, I am really, really enjoying this book. You wouldn't think so by the amount of time it has taken me to actually read the book, but I am really enjoying the story. It is about a woman who's a biologist of some kind. A biologist? Is that even a word? Yes, it is. But anyway, she goes on submarine expeditions into the deep sea to go and do research on all of the interesting creatures that live down there that we don't know exist, and to find new species of things, and to just basically do research on what's out there. And so in the book she goes on one of those research trips. She's supposed to be gone for 3 weeks, but something goes wrong and they end up having to, or they get stuck essentially in the ocean for 6 months. And in this time her wife is not really informed of what's going on. She knows that they've been delayed, because obviously she knows that her wife was only supposed to be gone for 3 weeks, and now she's been gone for 6 months. But she doesn't know the extent of how bad it actually is. The book sort of jumps back and forth. Well, it jumps between the two wives' perspectives, and it also jumps back and forth in time. So sometimes you get snapshots of before this last expedition that went wrong happened, and you get to see how they were before the wife went away and was gone for 6 months and came back essentially a completely different person. And then you get snapshots of what it was like when they were on the submarine and stuck in the ocean for 6 months, and you also get snapshots of present time, so what it's like for them to live together now and how they deal with each other, and how yeah, essentially that's all. So I feel like I'm not very good at describing books most of the time. I feel like I don't do a very good job, but I am very, very, very much enjoying this book. I think it's going to be one of my favorite books as well of the year, and I'm very glad that I bought this when I bought Eileen as well, because now I'm happy to have bought these books, because I'm enjoying this one so much. I would recommend this to everybody and anybody. I think this is the kind of book also that appeals to the masses. Everybody could read it and enjoy it and get something out of it. So go pick this up. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. That's my whole list of books I read so far this year. So when I finish reading this book, which is hopefully going to be soon, I will have read 8 books so far this year. I'm supposed to have read 12 books already by now, if I want to reach my reading goal at the end of the year. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I could recommend or talk about some books that would be interesting to you. If you hear meowing in the background, it is my cat trying to get my attention. I'm very sorry. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you again next week with another video.